An analysis of Governor Kathy Hochul's budget proposal by State Comptroller Tom DiNapoli's office echoes concerns from fiscal watchdogs about the instability of the proposed $260 billion spending plan, which leaves state policymakers looking at multi-billion-dollar budget deficits to address in the future. For more on the report, which also highlighted the governor's latest effort to curtail oversight of the comptroller's office, we are joined in the Capitol Press Room by State Comptroller Tom DiNapoli. Well, I want to begin with one of the moving parts in this budget process in the wake of the governor actually releasing her proposal, which is the announcement that the governor would like to send an additional $1 billion to New York City this fiscal year, as well as another $510 million annually to support their finances. And then we got the news right around the time your analysis was coming out that we want to spend another $150 million to support municipalities outside of the Big Apple. I didn't see this as part of your analysis. Maybe it's baked in there, but how are you digesting this news? And what do you think more broadly of the governor just sort of announcing midway through the process, by the way, here's some extra money to be spent around the state?
Well, as we've talked about on your show over the past several months, we come into this budget process in 2026 with revenues consistently coming in higher than projections. Now, of course, with the most updated projections, which have been significantly increased, in the short run, perhaps a little short of the updated projections. But I think, the context of the governor's budget proposal and these additional resources for municipalities is the fact that we've had strong economic growth that's resulted in higher tax revenue. Much of that, although not all of it, has to do with the strength on Wall Street. We haven't put out our bonus report yet. We'll do that sometime in March, but I'm sure it's going to be a very generous bonus season. So we're benefiting from the really strong year of profitability and bonuses coming out of the securities industry. So the money is there right now. What we've identified in our budget report is the concern for the out-year budget gaps that the Division of Budget has identified. And as you know, with the 30-day amendments, those out-year budget gaps have ticked up, a bit more, so just shy of $28 billion cumulative. And I think that's really the challenge as the legislature and the governor negotiate this budget. We may have the money today. There are obviously many pressing needs. Someone told me it's also an election year, which also has an interesting dynamic as far as certain decisions. Obviously, you have a new administration in New York City that has certain expectations and hope as far as support from the state. So, none of this is a surprise, but I do hope that as spending decisions are being made to balance the coming year's budget, that there's also consideration about the spending implications for what it will mean a year from now, 2 years from now, 3 years from now, with the backdrop of an uncertain economy with a lot of volatility and the federal cuts that will continue to be implemented, especially on health care.
Yeah, let's talk about the Washington, D.C. of it all, because you note in your analysis that the impact from D.C. includes changes to our social safety net, health care coverage for New Yorkers, as well as this question about reliability of dollars flowing to New York. But for the second year in a row, this governor has proposed a budget that is largely unresponsive to the realities of what is happening in the federal government, except for spending billions in extra state cash this year to make up for money that generally would have come from Washington. Is this choice by state policymakers to basically ignore the status quo of the Trump administration and GOP-led Congress, is that creating more long-term risk for our state finances?
No, I think it's, as I said, it's based on a short-term correct view that we have more money coming in than we thought we were going to have a year ago.
Right, but if we don't know what is going to come down the road, don't we need to address some of these structural changes in our budget?
It is always the challenge in New York that the focus is on balancing the budget for the coming year without paying as much attention as should be for the out-year budget gap. So we're kind of back to where we were right during COVID, Dave, as we talked about on your show. We got all this federal money that really helped us. But we're kind of back to the pre-COVID days where, with rare exception, you always start every budget cycle, with some kind of a gap. And we're back in that mode again. And I think that's unfortunate. That being said, again, because the feds are pulling back on some of these very important priorities, healthcare, education, nutrition, go down the list, the state is attempting to backstop some of those cuts. And perhaps there is a hope or perhaps an assumption that this November there'll be a change, at least in the House of Representatives, and maybe we'll start to see a reversal of some of this. But the other
Is that a good way to budget, though? Is that a good way to budget on how a midterm election might turn out?
I'm not saying that that's. I don't want to put my words in the governor's mouth, but my view as I go around the state is that in New York, where there are some battleground races going on, I think there's a good chance we will see a change in the House. But I think to your earlier point as well, one of the challenges with the whole federal picture is not just the money that is proposed as a cut. Even when they promise money, even when money has been owed to us, with this administration, they try to freeze it or pull it back. And then, our great Attorney General, Tish James, has to run to court, get the money unfrozen. It's just no way to govern. So this uncertainty of federal funding, whether it's the long-term issue of what the allocations will be or the short-term issue of them not fulfilling the commitments that are already there, whether it's the Gateway project or the child care subsidies, or you go down the long list, it just makes our budgeting effort even more complicated.
So the sentiment you've been expressing and have expressed in the past is this idea of prudent budgeting, being cautious, and you typically, and it seems for this conversation as well, are loath to make any sort of specific policy recommendations when it comes to taxing and spending. Is there anything that you would want to call for this year in terms of specific actions for the budget? Is there something that you say, yep, this is a good expenditure, this is a bad expenditure, this is a smart revenue projection, this is a problematic revenue projection? Anything specific that you want to address?
Well, look, here's my overall view. What we need is a budget that's in balance, certainly in the short run, but I would like to see a greater effort to balance the budget in the out years as well. I would like to see, especially because we are coming up with money for different initiatives, more money going into the reserves, something else we've talked about repeatedly. And while, we're at a higher reserve level than we've been in a long time, and more money is being allocated to the statutory reserves, which is my preference because they're more restrictive as far as when you would use them.
Sure.
Right? They should really be there for a true fiscal emergency, global financial crisis, COVID close down, not for short-term budget relief. There is no effort to increase the reserves. So while they may be putting more in statutory reserves, I'd like to see overall more money put into the reserves. I think that's especially important, again, given some of the uncertainty at the federal level and as far as the economy. At the end of the day, the legislature and the governor are the ones who are elected to make the policy choices on where to spend the money. The comptroller is not elected to do that. What the comptroller wants to see is that the budget be in balance. So when people say, well, we got to raise, more tax revenue, I say, well, to what end? What do you want to pay for? If people want to raise spending, I say, what is the revenue to back up that spending? At the end of the day, that is exactly the job of the legislature and the governor. They have to set the priorities. And then when they set the spending priorities, they have to make sure the revenue is there to balance it out. And that's what I will certainly be looking to. And again, we are in the short run benefiting from a higher than anticipated tax revenue base. A lot of that driven by what's been happening on Wall Street. No guarantee that that's going to continue to be the case, for next year or for the year after that. So if we can make some choices on spending now that will close those out-year gaps, I think that would be a smart thing to do. Absent that, if we're going to live with the gaps as they're currently presented, what are we doing to build up the reserves? Should we really come to, let's say there is a big market correction. I won't even say a crash. I'm not anticipating that. But at some point, there will be a correction in the markets, I believe. And what will that mean, for tax revenue coming in? What will it mean for capital gains activity? So that's what I'm looking for. If I had to pick one area where I'd like to see more money, especially if we're giving money here and there, more money into the reserves. That to me should be a priority.
Well, let's turn to a policy question in the budget, and this has to do with your oversight authority. The governor's looking to raise the thresholds on certain levels of discretionary state spending and strip your office of its approval power for purchase orders and other procurement transactions issued under centralized contracts as part of an effort that they say would accelerate the completion of these contracts. Can you point to any specific examples or maybe general trends of how the status quo, which has this authority that is now potentially being stripped, how it's benefited taxpayers or maybe organizations that have contracted with the state. What would you say about the status quo?
Well, the notion of increasing the threshold or exempting our review is based on a false assumption that the independent oversight of the Comptroller's office somehow slows down the efficiency of government. It's just not the case. Most contracts are turned around well within 2 weeks, usually even less than that. So well below the statutory opportunity for us to have months to review contracts. So there's not a question of efficiency. If there is a contract review that takes longer, it's because it's a more complex contract review, or perhaps there's been a protest from someone who lost out on a contract opportunity. So it really is a question of appropriate checks and balances. It's one thing to say, well, the controller can audit a contract or a payment after the fact, but that's looking backwards. The advantage of the sometimes called the pre-audit authority, the contract review authority, is that we can ensure that there's, first of all, a level playing field, and secondly, best value for the state and for taxpayers.
And yet, Comptroller, if I could just interject then, have you seen that play out in the current dynamic? Are there examples that you would point to, you'd say, our pre-approval process, our pre-audit authority has resulted in us saving money or improving contracts?
Yeah, no, I could get you a list of that, but I don't have that list in front of me while we're chatting. But we can certainly get you that for our next show. But it's not to me, this is just another example, not unique to this administration, where the executive would like the prerogative of not having to answer questions ahead of time, and I think that's fundamentally undermining what has been the accepted checks and balances. How many times have we talked over the years about the need to restore our contract authority? And thankfully, the legislature, with the support of this governor, restored that authority by and large. Were there some other areas where they cut us out? Yes, but it was more or less on the margins. Now we see a significant retreat. I mean, it's estimated, with our quick calculation, you're talking about around $3 billion worth of exemption as far as that contract review. And then there are some specific programs. So that would be kind of like permanent language. And then there's other language that's notwithstanding language of about another $1 billion on some specific programs in a host of areas, including health, but not exclusively Department of Health, where we'd be cut out. And now in the 30-day amendments, it's been expanded to include exemptions to SUNY and CUNY, which has often been an area, that's been very opaque as far as the decision-making going on. So, I'm hoping and, making very clear to our colleagues in the legislature, they should reject these proposals. I'm pleased that many of the unions that follow and have a concern about state procurement, state spending, have come out against these proposals, whether it's PEP or CSEA or UUP or some of the others, because they know that, in many cases, there needs to be another level of accountability and scrutiny. So this really would be going backward. At a time where everybody's expecting more accountability, more transparency, want to make sure, that we're spending money appropriately, because affordability is certainly tied to the amount of money that the state has to raise taxes for. Why would we be retreating in this area? It makes no sense.
Well, lastly, putting your campaign hat on for a second, the governor recently announced that she's going to turn down the state's public financing program, which is designed to amplify the role that small dollar donors play in our political system. You opted into this program a long time ago in the grand scheme of the election cycle. Can you talk about why you opted to opt in, why you think it was the right fit for you, or why you think this is a good program?
Well, I've always supported public financing, and especially, you remember when I first became controller, I said back before the legislature and the governor didn't seem keen on it, I said, start with the controller's office. Let us be a test case. And of course, they set up a very flawed test case, which we couldn't participate in. So I was pleased when this was put in the books, especially for controller, because, this is not a policy job, so you don't get the same interest in terms of folks donating. And because of ethical reasons, we are prohibited, it began voluntarily, and now it's a requirement, to take money from those who used to fund most of the previous controllers' campaigns, from the finance area, because of the potential conflict with making pension fund decisions uh, involving folks who you may be raising money from. So we're prohibited from that, and we've made further limitations as far as law firms doing work during certain times. So we have all kinds of limitations on where we could raise money and who we could raise money from. So for me, public financing provides that opportunity for smaller donors, people who just care about good government, to give money and to get a 6-to-1 match under the current guideline, up to $250. And I think that's just going to make it a more likely opportunity for us to have the resources to run a campaign.
Well, unfortunately, that's all the time we have for this conversation. We've been speaking with State Comptroller Tom DiNapoli. Comptroller, thank you so much for making the time. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Dave. Look forward to chatting again.
And for more Capitol Press Room content, visit capitolpressroom.org or wherever you download your favorite podcasts.